Hello, this is Lisa, and I want to let you know about a really special opportunity, and that is the Philadelphia Jung Seminar. The Philadelphia Jung Seminar meets for 10 hours on 8 weekends from September to December, and then from February to May. And it provides intimate lectures and workshops with leading Jungian analysts for an interactive experiential engagement with Jungian thought. Next year, it's going to be hybrid, with 2 of the meetings in person, that would be in September and May, and the rest of the meetings online. And this is a perfect way to deepen your understanding of Jung. We're welcoming clinicians as well as just people who have a passion for Jung. And so I urge you to check it out. You can go to cgjungphiladelphia.org and click on seminar, and we'll also put that link in the show notes.
Welcome to This Jungian Life. 3 good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod. Welcome once again to This Jungian Life. This week we're going to talk about the imp of the perverse, the title of a short story by Edgar Allan Poe. And the imp of the perverse is what we do when we act against common sense, we act against our own self-interest for reasons that are really not altogether conscious. There is something that draws us to do the very thing we really shouldn't do. So I think this is probably very familiar to most everybody, and we are going to explore this perverse imp in, we hope, a thoughtful and rational way.
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting concept, and Poe did us the great favor of coining this wonderful phrase for it. And I think as we talk about it today, you might be wondering now, what the heck are they talking about? But I think it'll become clear, and hopefully you'll be saying, oh, yeah, I know exactly what they're talking about. I'm so glad now that I have the language to discuss it. So I'll start with just summarizing the short story. It's a very short story. So it's in kind of classic Poe style. It's told in the first person, and the narrator is discussing this crazy human characteristic of sometimes acting very much against our self-interest. And then as an example, he reveals to the reader that many years ago, he killed a friend or a colleague or something simply because he could. There was an easy way to do it. He used a poisoned candle. He replaced this man's customary candle in his bedside with this poison candle. The man died, I guess, from poisonous fumes, and there was no reason to suspect foul play. It was kind of the perfect murder. And so then we find out that the narrator inherited this man's fortune, which is interesting, and we'll come back to that detail later, and lived for many a year with no problem. And then the narrator says that he was visited by the imp of the perverse, a desire to blurt out a confession of the murder, which he then does and is, sent to prison. So I'm going to read just a little bit about what Poe's narrator tells us about the imp of the perverse. So let's see. He says, "Through its promptings, we act without comprehensible object. Or, if this shall be understood as a contradiction in terms, we may so far modify the proposition as to say that through its promptings we act for the reason that we should not." And just going to read one more paragraph from the story because I think it's just so clear and lovely. He says, "We stand upon the brink of a precipice. We peer into the abyss. We grow sick and dizzy. Our first impulse is to shrink from the danger. Unaccountably, we remain. By slow degrees, our sickness and dizziness and horror become merged in a cloud of unnameable feeling. By gradations still more imperceptible, this cloud assumes shape, as did the vapor from the bottle out of which arose the genius in the Arabian Nights. But out of this our cloud, upon the precipice's edge, there grows into palpability a shape far more terrible than any genius or any demon of a tale, and yet it is but a thought, although a fearful one, and one which chills the very marrow of our bones with the fierceness of the delight of its horror. It is merely the idea of what would be our sensations during the sweeping precipitancy of a fall from such a height. And this fall, this rushing annihilation, for the very reason that it involves that one most ghastly and loathsome of all the most ghastly and loathsome images of death and suffering which have ever presented themselves to our imagination. For this very cause do we now the most vividly desire it. And because our reason violently deters us from the brink, therefore do we the most impetuously approach it. There is no passion in nature so demoniacally impatient as that of him who, shuddering upon the edge of a precipice, thus meditates a plunge. To indulge for a moment in any attempt at thought is to be inevitably lost, for reflection but urges us to forbear, and therefore it is, I say, that we cannot. If there be no friendly arm to check us, or if we fail in a sudden effort to prostrate ourselves backward from the abyss, we plunge and are destroyed. I think there must have been like a shortage of periods during the time that Poe was writing.
Not to mention the invention of that word precipitancy. But there it is, isn't it? Poe describes, as he does throughout his works, the mysterious power of the dark side of the shadow that lures us in its form as the imp of the perverse to doing the very thing we really should not. It seems to me that what we're talking about overall is not going to be new news to many listeners, which is an encounter with the unconscious that will hold the opposite of I could, just step off this cliff. I could, do all kinds of things. I have the power. And does that result in a dialogue between conscious and unconscious? Does it result in something productive, namely increased consciousness? Or do we get overwhelmed by the unconscious and lured into the pit, which is a theme in many a fairy tale? You're lured into the magic mountain and you succumb to the music and the dancing of the fairies.
I think it's maybe a good time to mention that Poe is not the only person to have described this phenomenon. And in fact, the French coined a wonderful term for it. The French term is l'appel du vide, and it's sort of the siren call of the void. So again, a very great descriptive phrase, and scientists have studied it, and their name for it is the high place phenomenon. And what science tells us is that about 50% of people have such thoughts when they're in a high place, or perhaps you're driving down a busy road and it suddenly occurs to you that you could just cross the median. There's all kinds of ways that these thoughts present themselves, and most of the time we don't act on them. And in fact, the science says that it's actually kind of paradoxically, it's actually an assertion of your will to live, that basically your brain is thinking, okay, I need to be careful here. And then maybe you step back, and that then there's a kind of post hoc rationalization that says, oh, I stepped back because I was thinking of jumping. So that science sees it as sort of like a little miscommunication in the brain. So it's not a problem when it's just these thoughts. And then I think there's a lot of other stuff to explore around it. But Deb, want to kind of bring it full circle back to the point that you made, that this is very much evidence of the unconscious in our lives, whether it's the thought or we actually act on some of these impulses.
And I think in a way, there is a merit simply to the fact that as humans, we can have all kinds of thoughts. We know that in the unconscious has all kinds of thoughts, as anybody who has ever recorded their dreams really knows. All kinds of really weird things take place in the unconscious, where everything seems to be permitted. And what happens is then that boundary, the differentiation between conscious and unconscious gets very thin. And so we have these perverse thoughts. I actually could do this. It is possible. So in a way, it's an encounter with the unconscious and what the dynamic between conscious and unconscious is. Do we keep some of these perverse thoughts back where they belong, which is in the unconscious, in the dream world, or are we overcome by them and we act them out?
This is an example from Jung's life about a sort of a perverse thought that he knew that he shouldn't think, and what happened when he engaged with it. But I think it's interesting because one of the important distinctions that I'm seeing emerge, Deb, as we talk is when the imp of the perverse just manifests as a thought and when it's something that we actually act out. And we have a few of those examples as well. But let's look at this one. This is from Memories, Dreams, Reflections. And I'm trying to figure out how old Jung was at this time. But he was young.
Yep.
Yeah, he was a kid. He said, one fine summer day, I came out of school at noon and went to the cathedral square. The sky was gloriously blue, the day one of radiant sunshine. The roof of the cathedral glittered, the sun sparkling from the new, brightly glazed tiles. I was overwhelmed by the beauty of the sight and thought, the world is beautiful, and the church is beautiful, and God made all this and sits above it, far away in the blue sky on a golden throne, and... Here came a great hole in my thoughts and a choking sensation. I felt numbed and knew only, don't go on thinking now. Something terrible is coming, something I do not want to think, something I dare not even approach. Why not? Because I would be committing the most frightful of sins. What is the most terrible sin? Murder? No, it can't be that. The most terrible sin is the sin against the Holy Ghost, which cannot be forgiven. Anyone who commits that sin is damned to hell for all eternity. That would be very sad for my parents if their only son, to whom they are so attached, should be doomed to eternal damnation. I cannot do that to my parents. All I need to do is not go on thinking. That was easier said than done. On my long walk home, I tried to think all sorts of other things, but I found my thoughts returning again and again to the beautiful cathedral, which I loved so much, and to God sitting on the throne. And then my thoughts would fly off again as if they had received a powerful electric shock. I kept repeating to myself, don't think of it. Just don't think of it. I reached home in a pretty worked up state. My mother noticed that something was wrong and asked, what is the matter with you? Has something happened at school? I was able to assure her without lying that nothing had happened at school. So he goes on. This is tormenting him for days. It goes day in and day out. And then he says that he has arrived at the conclusion that God wants him to think this thought. So he says, I gathered all my courage as though I were about to leap forthwith into hellfire and let the thought come. I saw before me the cathedral, the blue sky. God sits on his golden throne high above the world. And from under the throne, an enormous turd falls upon the sparkling new roof, shatters it, and breaks the walls of the cathedral asunder. So that was it. I felt an enormous and indescribable relief. And instead of expected damnation, grace had come upon me.
Jung engaged the opposites of the all good, all loving, beneficent God high up in heaven on a throne, and then this turd falling right through the roof of the cathedral. And I think this goes back to Edgar Allan Poe and how often and how well he engaged the dynamics of inner torment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're really kind of coming from the same place in the psyche. And it is that thought of the young Jungs, of the turd of God. It is a very impish and perverse thought.
Yeah.
And can we engage with that part of ourselves in some way? And in this case, engaging with the thought brought kind of an expansiveness, a sort of accepting that little kind of corner of perversity created this opportunity for greater understanding.
Mm-hmm. And I think right there we see the seeds of Jung's theory of opposites, and a light and a dark side to what we think of as the divine, or for Jung, he called it the self. We want to be good. We want to be moral. We want to be all these things, but it's one-sided. We do have a shadow.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened for Jung was the ability to integrate it. This is an altogether entirely internal process. And so he was able to integrate this shadow and feel this relief, and also realize that he wouldn't have been able to think the thought unless somehow all of it had come from God, in effect.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in what you were saying earlier, going back to what we think versus what we may or may not enact. And I'm thinking about also a corollary to that of what is simply an inner battle versus something that's very perverse but also has a motivation.
Mm-hmm.
And Jung talks about a couple of clinical cases that he had, where there was an underlying motivation, as there is in the Edgar Allan Poe story, because he inherits his murder victim's fortune.
Right. So he says that he kills the person just because he could, but in fact, that there was evidently this financial motivation as well.
And for Jung's clinical case vignettes that he recounts in his memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he talks about a woman who had discovered, she married, but she discovered that the man she had really loved had also been interested in her, and it was a missed opportunity. And as she was bathing her children, the bathing water came from a stream that had some contamination in it, and she allowed her children to drink some of the water and suck on a sponge. One of them died of typhoid. And some years later, she came to Jung and needed to confess and needed to purge herself of this terrible dilemma. And this, what Jung says about this is, in many cases, the patient who comes to us has a story that is not told, and which, as a rule, no one knows of. To my mind, therapy only really begins after the investigation of that wholly personal story. It is the patient's secret, the rock against which he is shattered. If I know the secret story, I have the key to the treatment. And I think that's the lifting up always of what is really going on here. Mm-hmm. What were you really thinking? Wouldn't it be great? I have this fantasy of if we could have the man from the Edgar Allan Poe story enter our consulting room, we might be able to discover the secret that says, what is it that you really want? Mm-hmm. What can we explore at this point? It would be a fantasy, murdering this man, because it's not for no reason.
Right.
You really would like to be the beneficiary of his wealth and fortune.
And I think in the story that you just told, Deb, there was a motive as well, was there not? Was she kind of let her kid get deathly ill?
I think she was really, there wasn't a material gain,
But I think she was in love with someone, wasn't she? And she wanted to be free to...
She realized she had missed an opportunity to marry the person she really loved, and some sense perhaps that if her children weren't there, she would again be free to revisit this potential opportunity. But I think, what Jung says, her mind was already under the shadow of the incipient depression.
Mm-hmm.
So here's the unconscious really, as it will do, the unconscious will have its way and have its say. And it put her in a bit of a kind of a fugue state, a mindless state, somewhat dissociative, not really paying attention. That state we all are familiar with of I really know better, but I'm just going to let it roll on.
So I have a couple of thoughts about that. One is that I think we're also in the realm of what Freud called the parapraxis. And that is, we think about it as the Freudian slip, where say we're talking to someone, we're giving an important presentation at work. And we know that we definitely need to the one thing we definitely need to not say is X. And we blurt out X. We know these moments, we've all been there. And, of course, they can be hilarious, but they can also be quite consequential. Freud thought about this, as did Jung, as the unconscious at work. It's kind of evidence of the unconscious. I think we can think about it as a kind of inner trickster that gets in our way. I also think we can think about it as the action of a complex. So Jung talked, as we've mentioned before on the podcast, Jung had a theory of complexes. It was a very important part of his theory. And complexes are almost little splinter personalities. They're little kind of parts of our consciousness that are somewhat loosely connected with ego, but we don't really have control over them. They get constellated around an archetypal core, and they wind up kind of accruing around certain experiences, so that if we have kind of a complex around rejection, we've had all these different experiences of rejection, and all of those experiences go to inform the nature and the quality of our complex. Then when the complex gets activated by something in the environment, we may be very much in that sort of slightly altered state of consciousness. It can warp our perception of things. We may do or say things that we wouldn't otherwise normally say or do. And so I think we can think about the imp of the perverse as perhaps the workings of a complex. And now I have a story, which is a little tender, but boy, the imp of the perverse was at work in this story. And it was many years ago, and yet, as I mentioned, it's still a little raw. But I must have been 16 or 17. I was a relatively new driver, and I came home one night, and I put the car in the garage, and I was about to step out of the car and realized that somehow I hadn't put it in park. I think it was in neutral or maybe reverse or something, and the car started just slowly drifting backwards. And I just didn't think. I don't know. Now it's very difficult for me to re-enter that space and think, what the hell was I thinking? Because I didn't turn on the brake. I didn't press the brake, nor did I close the door. So what happened was the door got caught on the outside of the garage as the car slid back, and it absolutely crunched the door against the front end of the car. And that's what eventually brought the car to a halt. I think I was surprised and so sort of taken by surprise, and my sort of instincts weren't working about what to do. But it was a rather shocking thing at the time, because I had a good number of seconds. I mean, it wasn't a case of it all happened so fast. What was going on for me that I didn't respond appropriately in that moment? I mean, I can now have a couple of theories about it, but I do think it was very much one of these imp of the perverse moments. Like, what would happen if I just, didn't do anything, So thank goodness, in the end, it was a fairly expensive repair bill, I'm sure, but no more than that.
And also, it seems to me, since it's still alive in memory, there you had a relatively benign experience of this and learned from it of what happens when the imp of the perverse comes up if I just let it happen. Well, that's not good. I really regret it. And I think that is partly what can happen with this, is that it can be a gateway to guilt of, oh my gosh, as in the case of that I just related from Jung's practice. It can be a gateway to real remorse and suffering, and that can lead to much greater consciousness. And I think the other reality here for almost everyone is that if we let the unconscious just run away with us, it is going to react. We don't really get away with it. The protagonist in the Edgar Allan Poe story spends some years and he's finally driven to confess, which is another imp of the perverse. It is absolutely against his interests, and off he goes to jail. The woman who allowed her children to drink contaminated water was racked by guilt. And Jung gives another case of a person whose unconscious punished her. She too committed murder. She wanted to marry her best friend's husband, and she poisoned her best friend. So, okay, that's not the imp of the perverse. That's just plain murderous mentality.
Yeah.
And she got her wish, her supposed wish, to marry the man. The child that she had by this man grew up and moved far, far away. Something about the mother really alienated this child. The woman was, Jung says, a passionate horsewoman with horses that she rode that she was very fond of. And then she discovered that the horses were beginning to grow nervous under her. Even her favorite horse shied and threw her off, and she had to give up riding. And then she clung to her dogs. And she had a beautiful wolfhound who became stricken with paralysis. And she had to confess. So she went to Jung for a one-time only consultation. She refused to give her name. She was sort of a high society type of person, but she had to confess. And I think that too is very interesting, that we need to feel accepted, understood, supported, forgiven. There's an interpersonal transaction that needs to take place, including in religious traditions where there is a confessor, that you go to a human who is the intermediary for the divine. But we need to come clean because the unconscious won't leave us alone.
Yeah, in some sense, this whole idea of the perfect murder is very much in the realm of the imp of the perverse. And of course, we see that in the Edgar Allan Poe story, where he thinks, well, I can just do it. The perfect murder in some sense is one without any motive, because then there's no reason to suspect you. Of course, the kind of quintessential story about this is Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, where in some sense the killing of the old woman is Raskolnikov's plan simply because he can. I mean, it's a little more complex than that, but it has that element to it. But then he, of course, is kind of persecuted with guilt, as you were talking about, Deb.
There, too, there's a motive.
Yes.
The protagonist, Raskolnikov, kills this old woman who's a pawnbroker. And she's hoarded her money and she hasn't been nice. And he thinks he could put that money to much better use than she can. And so it brings in the element of inflation, that Raskolnikov believed that extraordinary people have the, quote, the right to transgress. So he was entitled.
Yeah, yeah.
And that he would use this money for great deeds. But of course, he was racked by paranoia and shame and guilt and confusion. Dostoevsky does a wonderful, wonderful job of portraying the punishment that the unconscious will wreak.
You know, Deb, you just landed on something that I think is really interesting and important for this conversation, and that's this idea about inflation. Because I wonder if, partly we get this impulse, say, to, step off a high building. And the countervailing thought that comes of, no, I'd better not do that, is really kind of grounding and reminding us, hey, I'm mortal. Because there is a sense, that is a kind of sense of inflation. Like, what if I just stepped off? What would happen? It's like, would I kind of meet the expected consequence, or am I a Superman, as it were? Which is kind of where Raskolnikov was. He thought, I can step off this precipice and I won't meet the ordinary fate. So this brings to mind another example, I think, of the perverse from Jung that I would like to read. So this is Jung talking about the importance of dreams. He's talking about a colleague in Zurich. He says, he was a man somewhat older than myself, whom I saw from time to time, and who always teased me on these occasions about my interest in dream interpretation. I met him one day in the street, and he called out to me, "How are things going? Are you still interpreting dreams? By the way, I've had another idiotic dream. Does it mean something too?" He had dreamed as follows. I am climbing up a high mountain over steep, snow-covered slopes. I mount higher and higher. It is marvelous weather. The higher I climb, the better I feel. I think, if only I could go on climbing like this forever. When I reach the summit, my happiness and elation are so strong that I feel I could mount right up into space, and I discover that I actually can do this. I go on climbing on empty air. I awake in real ecstasy. When he had told me his dream, I said, "My dear man, I know you can't give up mountaineering, but let me implore you not to go alone from now on. When you go, take 2 guides, and you must promise on your word of honor to follow their directions." "Incorrigible," he laughed, replying, and said goodbye. I never saw him again. 2 months later came the first blow. When out alone, he was buried by an avalanche, but was dug out in the nick of time by a military patrol which happened to come along. 3 months after this, the end came. He went on a climb accompanied by a younger friend, but without guides. An alpinist standing below him saw him literally step out into the air as he was letting himself down a rock wall. He fell onto the head of his friend who was waiting beneath him, and both were dashed to pieces far below. That was an ecstasis in the full meaning of the word. So we're protected, in some sense, by acting on these perverse impulses because we're grounded in reality. But when inflation visits us, then we really are potentially at the mercy of the imp of the perverse.
It's a very graphic and ever-chilling story. We both remembered it, and there is something that is just incredibly sad about this story, and that what can happen with this man who wants to climb. He wants to go to the high places, wants to be more than mortal, more than ordinary. And it goes back to Dostoevsky's protagonist of an extraordinary man versus we are ordinary and we are mortal. And what will happen if you step off the mountain is that gravity will plummet you to the earth. Of course, the myth about that is Icarus, who became inflated, and they were escaping from a high castle, and his genius father made them wings that were held together with wax. The feathers were glued on with wax. And Daedalus, his father, said, "Don't fly too high, or the sun will melt the wax in your wings." But when they took off, Icarus was so elated that he couldn't resist going higher and higher. And of course, he fell. So that brings in yet another mythological theme, which is the fall, of how we fall and how, from what kind of a height and how severe will it be. In the case of you and the car sliding out of the garage, that was, as these things go, not a disastrous consequence. The man stepping off, well, I hesitate to imagine the scene with your parents. However, in the scheme of things, it's not as disastrous as stepping off a mountain. So that kind of takes me to the idea of a spectrum of imps, of little ones and really terribly demonic ones. I think one example of a little tiny imp might be procrastination. And I think we've all been there. I really have to water those plants. I just don't want to do it now. I don't want to do it tonight either. And then I have other stuff to do tomorrow. And what happens? Or procrastinating on a project and somehow get caught up in, I have to get all the laundry done and I have to, do this and I have to do that. And then I'll settle in and I'll write that paper or I'll do the project. And then it's really too late to get it done on time. Versus at the far end of the spectrum, some of the cases that we have been talking about. But that imp is there.
I want to just walk around this another 30 degrees or something and come at it from a slightly different perspective. We've already brought up Dostoevsky, who I think explored this theme by not by that name in many of his works. And one of them was in Notes from the Underground. And here he really talks about this perversity as being related to the human need for free will, to do something just to do it without it having any kind of common sense. And so I've got a few quotes here from Notes from the Underground. I think this is my day to be reading here, but it's just so great that I can't resist it. He says, "Man really is stupid, phenomenally stupid. That is, he's by no means stupid, but rather he's so ungrateful that it would be hard to find the likes of him. I, for example, would not be the least bit surprised if suddenly, out of the blue, amid the universal future reasonableness, some gentleman of ignoble, or better, of retrograde and jeering physiognomy, should emerge, set his arms akimbo, and say to all of this, 'Well, gentlemen, why don't we reduce all of this reasonableness to dust with one good kick for the sole purpose of sending all these logarithms to the devil and living once more according to our own stupid will?' That would still be nothing, but what is offensive is that he'd be sure to find followers. That's how man is arranged. And all this for the emptiest of reasons, which would seem not even worth mentioning, namely that man, whoever he might be, has always and everywhere liked to act as he wants, and not at all as reason and profit dictate. And one can want even against one's own profit, and one sometimes even positively must." So Dostoevsky is saying there, that this is kind of required almost to really be human, that we do things that are perverse, that are against our own interest, that it makes us human instead of just almost sort of following some kind of algorithm about what is best for us. It's a real assertion of humanity.
An assertion of free will, an assertion of just the psychological truth that every position entails its own opposite or its own negation. And what you just read takes me to our ability to choose. And the earliest expression of that we have come to call the terrible twos, where, even if it's not in his own self-interest, that toddler will say, no, 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 and no, And sometimes you can even say, are you sure you really don't want a cookie? And he's just on a roll and he says, no. We have to assert ourselves against structure, authority, whatever, for all kinds of reasons. And then we have the capability, and we have to bear the consequences of choice. Did that man listen to Jung, who was, really not respecting Jung and not respecting the power of his dream, and stepped off the mountainside? What is in consciousness? What have we chosen? And we're the only creature that really has much at all, if anything, in the way of choice. And that's our gift, and it can also be our burden, because sometimes we make the wrong choice simply because the temptation to do it was not confronted sufficiently by consciousness.
I want to pick up one more thing, just a loose thread that I think is worth mentioning, which is going all the way back to Jung's thought about the turd on the cathedral. Those thoughts caused him a lot of distress because he felt that he wasn't allowed to think them. And for some of us who experience this l'appel du vide, for example, we may find ourselves so distressed by those thoughts that we disallow them, and that just kind of turns up the heat on this whole phenomenon. And we may spend so much time trying not to think about things that they get experienced then as in what we would call intrusive thoughts. And this can actually be related to obsessive-compulsive disorder. Some people experience obsessive-compulsive disorder primarily through such intrusive thoughts that often demand rituals in order to avoid thinking the thought or to keep it at bay. And there's even a particular kind of obsessive-compulsive disorder called scrupulosity, which is, I think, very related to what Jung was having happen with this image of the Basel Cathedral, that you think, I'm not allowed to think this, I'm not allowed to think this, I'm not allowed to think this. And it can become quite distressing, and to the extent that it prevents us from being able to kind of do our lives, to go to work, to have conversations. Maybe it takes us twice as long to get to work because we're performing all kinds of rituals to keep ourselves from thinking those illicit thoughts. Then it's really a problem. So this Imp the Perverse kind of has little tentacles into this area of obsessive compulsive disorder, and perhaps the remedy to that, in some sense, is to do what Jung did, which is, allow himself to think the thought and to recognize that there was no negative consequence as a result.
To think the thought and feel the feelings.
Yes.
Which are often very intense and very, very hard to bear. But something is knocking at the door and needs and wants to be admitted to consciousness, just as Jung finally realized that he had to think the thought about the turd falling through the roof of the cathedral. And actually, as we think about it and talk about it here, is that really so terrible? Mm-hmm. It was a thought. It was not an action. But kids tend to conflate thought and action, that if I think a bad thought, then somehow it might happen. And therefore, we try to repress the whole thing. If only that worked, but it doesn't.
Right. So some of what may come knocking on your door may be a little impish and perverse. It's not necessarily a good idea to act on these. But it's certainly, we can welcome the impish and perverse thoughts.
Yes.
And maybe with that, we will switch to a dream.
Did you know your dreams reveal the wisdom of your guiding self? Dreams connect us to the secret world within and remind us that we're never alone. we're always accompanied by our inner companion who offers healing, balance, insight, and guidance as we make key decisions. At 28, Charles felt lost and isolated. He had a dream that touched him deeply. As he worked with the dream in dream school, he understood that it was showing him how he was profoundly connected to life. This powerful insight led him to make real progress with his goals. During Dream School's 12-month transformational program, you'll learn to harness the power of your unconscious wisdom, decode the language of metaphor and symbol, discover mythological motifs that shape your life, reveal unknown facets of your personality, unlock the door to inner wisdom. To enroll, just go to interpretmydream.net and sign up today to gain immediate access to the first 3 Dream School modules. Your best life awaits you at Dream School, and we can't wait to see you there.
Today's dreamer is a 36-year-old man who works as a judge. And here's the dream. I'm with my wife and child on the North Pole. We are in a small cabin. I don't know why we are here or how we got here. It is not a familiar place, but I'm not surprised to be here. There is a blizzard raging outside. Inside it is dark. A fire is burning in a traditional cast iron stove. We huddle together by the fire. I am responsible for the fire. The door blows open and I can see the white blizzard outside. I fear that my daughter will somehow be sucked into the blizzard. I manage to close the door. I search for firewood, but the cabin is dark and unfamiliar. I venture out into the storm and find some firewood. I return inside to tend the fire. I find my wife and daughter asleep by the stove. And for context, Hugh notes, I'm on paternity leave and will be for about 6 more months. I've been pondering a change of career once the paternity leave is over. And he says the main feelings were a fear of the blizzard and worry that his child would be hurt, and that he felt pride and satisfaction when he was able to tend the fire. And he notes in terms of associations that the cabin and the cast iron stove reminds him of his father's lodge in the very north of the country. The stove is very simple and traditional. He says, I associate blizzards with my military service, which I served north of the Arctic Circle. Firewood is essential in that climate. The wife and child seem like his actual wife and child, and he has no further associations. And he notes that the North Pole is ice, snow, barren, and deadly.
What comes up for me, as is my predilection, is the very first part of the dream, which is the psychic situation as it is. I'm with my wife and child on the North Pole. And very often, scenes where it's snowing, where it's cold, where there's ice, absolutely descriptive of the North Pole, are situations where feeling has been frozen. It's cold. We talk about that all the time in relation to feelings and emotion. If somebody is a cold person versus a warm person. So there is a psychic situation in the midst of just, I think, a very new, very challenging life situation. It is a really big deal to start a family and have a baby for whom you are responsible. You must provide. You must, in this dream, bring in the firewood and heat the home. And I think for many men, as much as they love this baby, and isn't he fortunate to have such generous paternity leave, by the way, it's also very scary. It's scary for moms, too. This little, tiny, vulnerable human being, and all of a sudden we have been saddled with a giant responsibility.
I appreciate your lifting up the setting of this kind of frozen land. And it is interesting. Why did the dream get set there? I mean, there's a couple different ways to go with that, I suppose. But I do find myself curious about his wondering about a career change. That's something again, if I had this dreamer here, I would be so curious about that. And is that relevant somehow? Here he is on on paternity leave. And my sense, my imagination, I suppose, from the dream is that he's finding it satisfying in some way, being the protector, playing that role and doing it effectively. And so what is it like then to have this perspective on his career now that he has a chance to step away from it? And so I guess I'm wondering whether the setting in some way relates to the career.
Yes.
I might be wrong about that, just a question. I also think it's very interesting that he says, I am responsible for the fire.
Mm-hmm.
It's a wonderful image, right? I mean, in some sense, the fire in our lives, our kind of inner hearth, is something that we all have to tend to. We have to tend to our fire. We have to keep it stoked. And here he is responsible for sort of the fire of the family. On one level, I think this dream shows, as I think you were getting to, Deb, this life situation of recognizing that now you're the kind of pater familias, as it were, and you need to provide for this family and protect this family and care for this family. And the dreamer is really rising to that occasion, and he's doing it with courage and care, and I believe that he's enjoying it.
Yeah.
While finding it a burden. But I also wonder about another possible way to read the dream, which is, what's the marriage like? And why is he responsible for the fire?
It's a really interesting question of the hearth and the warmth, which is traditionally an image of the feminine. It was the center of the home. Hestia was the goddess of the hearth, et cetera, et cetera. But as we wend our way through and around this dream, I'm thinking, I wonder if he is so enjoying his paternity leave and being able to be the tender of the fire, providing warmth and emotional warmth and care, that what is really the North Pole is just exactly what the dream says. It's out there. In here, we're okay. I can close the door and I can tend the fire. He has two female images here, his wife and daughter, a baby and his wife. And I wonder if it's the career change that feels like the blizzard out there, that does he dare to go out in the cold and contemplate and perhaps effect a career change, that it's the external world.
But it's interesting because that's where the firewood is.
Yes, of course. You have to go out to get the firewood. Mm-hmm. And there's the dilemma. Mm-hmm. But that the home is compelling. Mm-hmm. He would like to not only be home and enjoying the paternity leave, but those elements of care, protection, tending the fire, intimacy, connection, all of that stuff inside versus the external world feeling harsh.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.